January 1945. The Ardennes Forest. The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the Belgian countryside, muffling the distant thunder of artillery. In a commandeered farmhouse near Bastogne, a German officer sat hunched over a wooden table, his breath visible in the frozen air. Before him lay a captured American ration tin, olive drab metal, surprisingly heavy, stamped with English words he could barely read. His fingers, blue with cold and trembling from more than just the temperature, worked at the lid with a desperation that would have shamed him months earlier. When it finally opened, the smell that emerged, rich, fatty, impossibly abundant, made him close his eyes. Not in pleasure, but in something closer to grief. Outside, his men huddled in foxholes lined with pine branches and newspaper, burning furniture they'd torn from abandoned houses just to survive another night. Their daily ration, when it came at all, consisted of perhaps 700 calories, a portion of dark bread so coarse it cut their mouths, a thin soup made from potato peelings and whatever could be scavenged, occasionally a sliver of ersatz sausage that contained more sawdust than meat. Many hadn't tasted real coffee in months. Some hadn't eaten properly in weeks. Yet across the line, sometimes only hundreds of yards away, American soldiers sat in relatively heated tents, opening their own ration tins to discover chocolate bars, cigarettes, canned fruit, beef stew with genuine meat, and coffee so strong and plentiful they sometimes threw half of it away. This wasn't just a disparity in supplies. This was a chasm that revealed the fundamental nature of two different worlds, two different philosophies of war, two different visions of what human life was worth. And for the German commander staring at that American tin, it was the beginning of an understanding that would corrode his faith in everything he'd been told about the superiority of the Reich, the weakness of democracy, and the inevitable triumph of German will over material abundance. The contrast had been building for years, but it crystallized in these final desperate months of the war with a clarity that could no longer be ignored or explained away by propaganda. The average American soldier in Europe consumed approximately 3,500 calories per day, more than many American civilians back home, more than any other army in history. The rations came in bewildering variety. C rations with their 6 different menus. K rations designed for paratroopers and mobile units. The heavier 10-in-1 rations for group feeding. And the legendary B units that could supply a complete hot meal for 100 men. There were specialized rations for tropical climates, Arctic conditions, survival situations. There were auxiliary packs containing nothing but candy and chewing gum. The American supply apparatus delivered not just food, but abundance, not just sustenance, but choice. Meanwhile, the German soldiers' ration had been contracting since 1943, shrinking month by month as the noose of Allied bombing and naval blockade tightened around the Reich. By early 1945, the official daily ration for frontline troops had been reduced to less than 2,000 calories. And even that figure existed mostly on paper. In reality, supply lines had collapsed. The trains that should have brought food to the front brought ammunition instead, when they ran at all. The horses that pulled supply wagons had themselves been slaughtered for meat. The warehouses in the rear areas stood empty, their contents either consumed, destroyed by bombing, or simply never produced because Germany's agricultural and industrial capacity had been systematically dismantled by years of strategic air attacks. But this was about more than numbers, more than the mathematics of calories and protein. This was about philosophy made manifest in tin and chocolate, ideology expressed in the language of abundance versus scarcity. The German military machine had been built on a foundation of romantic brutalism. The notion that superior will could overcome material disadvantage, that hardness of character mattered more than comfort, that the Spartan ideal of the warrior sustained by bare necessity represented a higher form of martial virtue. There was contempt baked into this philosophy, contempt for the soft democracies that needed to pamper their soldiers, that couldn't ask true sacrifice, that tried to fight a war without suffering. When German officers studied American logistics in the pre-war years, they saw weakness disguised as strength. All those resources devoted to keeping soldiers comfortable, to maintaining morale through material satisfaction, to ensuring that fighting men ate as well or better than they did at home. This wasn't military efficiency. This was democratic decadence, and for a while, In those intoxicating early years of German victory, the philosophy seemed validated. German soldiers high on Pervitin and ideological fervor had smashed through Poland in weeks, through France in months, had driven deep into the Soviet Union on iron rations and fanatical belief. Who needed 3,000 calories when you had the certainty of destiny, the pride of belonging to a superior people, the electric thrill of endless victory? The propaganda had been clear. German soldiers were strong because they were hard, effective because they expected nothing, victorious because they embodied a higher form of human will cannot digest itself. Ideology provides no vitamins. Faith generates no proteins. And by the winter of 1945, in that frozen farmhouse in Belgium, the philosophy lay exposed as the catastrophic delusion it had always been. The American approach to military feeding had roots that reached back to the Civil War, to a recognition that armies traveled on their stomachs not as poetic metaphor, but as biological fact. By World War I, the United States military had established the principle that fighting men deserved not just adequate nutrition, but generous portions, variety, and quality that approached civilian standards. When America entered World War II, this philosophy expanded into an industrial-scale commitment to abundance. The Quartermaster Corps became one of the largest logistics organizations in human history, employing food scientists, nutritionists, psychologists, and industrialists to solve a problem that went beyond mere survival: how to keep millions of men not just alive, but fighting effectively, maintaining morale, sustaining the physical and psychological resilience needed for modern mechanized warfare. The result was a food system of staggering complexity and generosity. At bases in England, North Africa, Italy, France, and the Pacific, American mess halls served hot meals that included fresh meat, vegetables, bread, dairy products, desserts. When hot meals couldn't reach the front lines, the ration system ensured that even isolated units received food that was varied, calorie-dense, and supplemented with small luxuries that acknowledged the humanity of the soldiers consuming them. Every care ration included cigarettes because the military understood that morale mattered. Every 10-in-1 ration included toilet paper because dignity mattered. The D-ration emergency chocolate bar was specifically formulated to taste just good enough that soldiers would eat it in genuine emergencies, but not so delicious they'd consume their emergency supplies casually. Even the emergency food reflected sophisticated understanding of human psychology. This wasn't waste, and it wasn't softness. This was industrial democracy recognizing that human beings fight better when treated as valuable individuals rather than expendable components. The American military didn't feed its soldiers 3,500 calories daily because American generals were soft-hearted. They did it because the data, the research, the empirical evidence all demonstrated that well-fed soldiers marched farther, shot straighter, thought more clearly, resisted disease better, and maintained combat effectiveness longer than malnourished troops. The abundance wasn't indulgence. It was ruthless pragmatism wrapped in democratic values that insisted every citizen soldier deserved to be sustained not just minimally, but well. For German soldiers encountering this system, the shock operated on multiple levels simultaneously. There was the immediate physical impact. Captured or surrendered German troops gaining 5 to 10 pounds in their first week of American custody, their bodies responding to adequate nutrition like desert plants to sudden rain. There was the psychological disorientation of discovering that the supposedly soft and decadent enemy possessed organizational capabilities that dwarfed anything Germany had achieved. And beneath both of these, more disturbing still, was the ideological vertigo of recognizing that abundance wasn't weakness but strength. That democracy's commitment to human dignity translated directly into military effectiveness. That everything they'd been told about the superiority of hardness and sacrifice had been, from the beginning, a lie designed to make deprivation bearable. The German commander in that Belgian farmhouse wasn't just discovering that Americans ate better. He was discovering that the entire philosophical foundation of National Socialism's military doctrine had been built on sand. That the contempt for materialism masked Germany's inability to match democratic industrial capacity. That the romance of suffering existed primarily to justify failure. Records from German units in the final year of the war paint a portrait of systematic nutritional collapse. A report from the 7th Army in December 1944 noted that frontline troops were receiving an average of 900 calories daily, about one-quarter of what they needed to sustain combat operations. Medical officers documented epidemic levels of malnutrition-related diseases, scurvy from vitamin C deficiency, beriberi from lack of B vitamins, a resurgence of tuberculosis among troops whose immune systems had collapsed from chronic hunger. One regimental surgeon in Army Group B reported that 70% of his casualties weren't from enemy fire, but from malnutrition, exposure, and diseases that healthy bodies would have resisted easily. The hunger affected everything. German soldiers who should have been fighting spent their days foraging, stealing from civilians, slaughtering livestock that should have been preserved for agriculture. Unit cohesion dissolved as starving men prioritized individual survival over collective military objectives. The legendary discipline of the German army, built on decades of Prussian tradition and National Socialist indoctrination, crumbled when confronted with the simple biological fact that starving people cannot maintain the psychological and physical reserves required for military effectiveness today. Particularly revealing document survived the war. A letter from a German lieutenant to his brother, intercepted by Allied intelligence in March 1945. The lieutenant described watching his men cry while eating captured American rations, not from joy but from rage and despair at understanding how thoroughly they'd been betrayed. "We were told the Americans were weak," he wrote. "We were told their dependence on comfort would be their downfall. But they bring their comfort with them. They carry their civilization on their backs. And we, who were supposed to be harder, stronger, more willing to sacrifice, we are reduced to fighting over potato peels while they throw away food we would consider a feast. This is not strength facing weakness. This is the future devouring the past." The symbolism of the ration tin itself became impossible to ignore. These small metal containers, millions of them, represented an industrial and organizational achievement that Germany, for all its vaunted engineering prowess and military efficiency, simply could not match. Each tin required steel, tin plating, rubber gaskets, precise manufacturing. Each required a supply chain that stretched from American farms to processing, plants to transportation networks to distribution, systems that could deliver millions of individual portions to specific units in specific locations, across multiple continents. The rations weren't just food, they were proof of concept. Physical evidence that democratic capitalism could organize human activity on a scale and with an efficiency that totalitarian central planning could not hope to match. German propaganda had always mocked American materialism, the obsession with consumer goods and comfort, the inability to embrace noble suffering for greater purposes. But standing in a frozen forest watching your men die slowly from starvation, while across the line American soldiers complained about the monotony of canned peaches, the propaganda revealed itself as the desperate delusion of a regime that confused deprivation with virtue because it had no choice. The Japanese encountered similar revelations in the Pacific, though the contrast there was even more extreme. Japanese military culture had elevated suffering to a spiritual principle, Bushido ideology insisting that endurance of hardship demonstrated moral superiority. Japanese soldiers in the Pacific received rations that averaged 12 to 1,500 calories daily when supply lines functioned, and often went days or weeks without resupply when naval dominance shifted to the Americans. On islands like Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Philippines, Japanese troops resorted to eating grass, tree bark, leather equipment, even the bodies of dead comrades. Meanwhile, American forces in the Pacific received the same generous rations as their counterparts in Europe, supplemented with specialized tropical versions that included salt tablets, anti-malarial chocolate, and additional water. The contrast became so extreme that Japanese commanders struggled to maintain discipline among troops who could smell American cooking from their positions, who knew that surrender meant food, who had watched their comrades literally starve to death while fighting an enemy that never seemed hungry. A captured Japanese officer on Okinawa told his interrogators a story that circulated through the intelligence community for its insight into the psychological impact of nutritional disparity. His unit had prepared for a final banzai charge, expecting to die gloriously rather than surrender. But the night before the attack, the wind had shifted, carrying the smell of American breakfast cooking, bacon, eggs, coffee, pancakes. The officer said half his men had been unable to complete the charge, not because they chose surrender over death, but because their bodies, ravaged by months of near starvation, simply couldn't generate the physical energy required. Spiritual commitment meant nothing when the body lacked the basic fuel to translate will into action. We were defeated by abundance, he said. Not by weapons, by food. You demonstrated that your system could provide for your soldiers in ways ours never could, never even attempted. That was the real victory. This wasn't inevitable. Germany in 1939 had been the most scientifically and industrially advanced nation in Europe, with agricultural production that should have been sufficient to feed both civilian population and military forces. But National Socialist economics had prioritized ideology over efficiency, autarky over trade, military production over civilian needs. The regime had structured its entire economic system around preparation for war, but had catastrophically underestimated the resources required to sustain military operations once war actually began. The contrast with American preparation was stark. The United States had spent the pre-war years building agricultural and industrial capacity that exceeded immediate needs, creating surplus that could be mobilized for military purposes without devastating the civilian economy. American farms produced more food than Americans could eat. American factories produced more goods than Americans could buy. This excess, which critics had often attacked as inefficient overproduction, became in wartime the decisive strategic advantage. Democracy's tolerance for abundance, for productive capacity that exceeded centralized plans, for economic flexibility that allowed rapid scaling, translated directly into military power. By 1943, the United States was producing enough food to feed its own military, supply its allies through Lend-Lease, maintain adequate civilian nutrition at home, and still generate agricultural exports. Germany, by contrast, was rationing bread to its civilian population while its soldiers at the front starved. The philosophical implications were impossible to ignore. The democratic system that National Socialism condemned as weak, inefficient, and decadent had proven capable of organizing human productive capacity on a scale that totalitarian efficiency could not approach. The food disparity also revealed the different ways the two systems valued human life. American military doctrine treated soldiers as valuable assets to be preserved, maintained, and supported with every available resource. The generous rations weren't charity, they were investment. Recognition that trained soldiers represented enormous expenditure of resources and that keeping them healthy, strong, and combat effective was simple economic rationality. The American military didn't provide chocolate bars and cigarettes because generals were sentimental, but because the data showed that small morale-sustaining luxuries improved combat performance measurably. German military doctrine, particularly as it evolved under National Socialism, treated soldiers as ultimately expendable components in a larger mystical project of racial destiny. The rhetoric celebrated sacrifice, glorified suffering, romanticized death. This wasn't just propaganda, it was reflected in practical decisions about resource allocation. The regime devoted enormous resources to wonder weapons, to prestige projects, to maintaining the comfort of the leadership class, while systematically underfunding the logistical systems that would have kept frontline soldiers adequately supplied with food, clothing, and medical care. The consequences appeared in medical statistics that starkly illustrated the human cost of ideological contempt for material welfare. American soldiers wounded in combat had an approximately 97% survival rate if they reached medical facilities, the highest in military history, reflecting not just medical expertise, but the understanding that injured soldiers who had been properly nourished before injury recovered more successfully. German wounded, malnourished before injury, and often lacking adequate medical supplies after, died at far higher rates from infections and complications that well-fed bodies would have resisted. For German commanders with sufficient intellectual honesty to see clearly, the disparity forced a reckoning with fundamental assumptions. The mythology of Germanic superiority had rested partially on the belief that harsh conditions forged superior character, that peoples accustomed to struggle and deprivation developed strengths that soft, comfortable democracies lacked. But the evidence before their eyes demonstrated the opposite, that populations raised in abundance, educated in prosperity, expecting comfort as their birthright, proved perfectly capable of fighting, effectively when necessary, and fought better because they came from systems that valued their lives enough to sustain them properly. A telling incident occurred during the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West. German troops overran American positions and found themselves suddenly in possession of American supply dumps. The attacking units, many of which hadn't eaten properly in weeks, essentially paused their advance to eat. They consumed captured rations, brewed captured coffee, smoked captured cigarettes. Some units spent hours just sorting through the abundance, unable to quite believe what they were seeing. The offensive, which depended on speed and momentum, slowed and eventually stalled partially because German soldiers who had been starving couldn't resist stopping to eat properly for the first time in months. American commanders, reading intelligence reports about this phenomenon, had trouble understanding it initially. Why would professional soldiers prioritize eating over military objectives? The answer was that German soldiers had long since ceased to be professional soldiers in the sense Americans understood the term. They were starving men in uniforms, their physical and psychological reserves depleted to the point where basic survival needs overrode military discipline. The same offensive found American units surrounded at Bastogne, but those units maintained combat effectiveness even when cut off from regular supply because they'd been so well supplied before encirclement that they could sustain combat operations on what they had on hand. The difference wasn't courage or training, it was nutrition. The symbolic power of American abundance extended beyond the battlefield. When German civilians in occupied Western Germany encountered American forces in 1945, one of the first and most psychologically destabilizing experiences was seeing American soldiers distribute food to hungry civilians from their own rations without apparent concern about scarcity. The gesture wasn't entirely altruistic. Part of it was pragmatic recognition that starving populations created instability, but it demonstrated a casual abundance that shattered propaganda narratives about American weakness and German superiority. A German woman in the Rhineland described watching American soldiers give chocolate bars to children, not occasionally as special treats, but routinely, as if chocolate was so common it could be distributed freely to enemy civilians. We had been told the Americans were suffering, that their economy was collapsing, that they were desperate, she later recalled. But they gave away more food in a day than we had seen in months. Everything we had been told was lies. The poverty was ours. The weakness was ours. They had won not just the war, but the argument about which system better serves human needs. For the German officers trying to make sense of their defeat, the food disparity became a window into a larger truth about the systemic differences between democracy and fascism. National Socialism had promised efficiency through authoritarian control, strength through centralized planning, victory through superior will. But in practice, the authoritarian system had proven catastrophically inefficient at the basic task of feeding its military. The central planning had failed to account for the complexity of sustaining modern warfare. The emphasis on over material resources had produced not strength but collapse. Meanwhile, the democratic system, with its messy debates and competing interests and apparent inefficiency, had somehow organized itself to produce abundance on a scale that exceeded any centralized plan. The very features that fascist ideology identified as democratic weaknesses, the attention to individual welfare, the tolerance for consumer preferences, the commitment to maintaining civilian living standards even during war, had proven to be sources of resilience and strength. Democracy's respect for human dignity translated into logistical systems that treated soldiers as valuable individuals worth sustaining properly. Democracy's commitment to abundance translated into industrial capacity that could outproduce autarky. Democracy's materialism translated into military power. The philosophical transformation this forced among thoughtful German officers was profound and painful. Many had joined the military not because they were convinced National Socialists, but because military service was honorable tradition, because they believed in German greatness, because the alternative was disgrace or worse. They had seen the early victories and believed, or wanted to believe, that German superiority was real. But standing in the ruins of that belief, with their starving men around them and American abundance visible across the line, they had to confront the possibility that everything they'd thought they understood about strength and weakness, efficiency and waste, civilization and decadence, had been inverted. The ration tin sitting on that commander's table in the Belgian farmhouse was more than food. It was evidence. It was argument. It was philosophy made physical. The weight of it in his hand, the variety of contents inside, the casual abundance. It represented. All of this demonstrated truths that propaganda could no longer obscure. His men were starving not because they lacked will or discipline or German character, but because the system that sent them to war had never taken seriously the question of how to sustain them. The Americans eating their 3,500 calories daily weren't doing so because they were soft or undisciplined, but because their system actually worked, actually delivered, actually organized human resources with an effectiveness that German central planning had only pretended to achieve. Historical records from the post-war period document this transformation among captured German officers. Interviews with prisoners of war reveal a common pattern. Initial contempt for American abundance giving way to grudging respect, then to troubling questions about what that abundance revealed about systemic effectiveness, finally to fundamental doubt about the ideological framework that had dismissed materialism as weakness. An officer captured in the Ruhr pocket told his interrogators, "We despised you for caring about comfort. We thought it meant you couldn't suffer, couldn't fight. But you brought your comfort with you and fought anyway. We were the ones who couldn't fight without it. The hardness we cultivated was just lack. You proved that abundance and fighting effectiveness aren't contradictory. That might be your greatest victory, demonstrating that the choice between comfort and strength was false, that the system which provides for its people is stronger, not weaker." The Japanese experience paralleled the German, but with additional cultural dimensions. Japanese military culture had elevated suffering to an almost religious principle, the idea that endurance of hardship purified the spirit and demonstrated moral worth. When Japanese soldiers in the Pacific found themselves systematically starved by American naval dominance cutting supply lines, the ideology initially helped them endure conditions that would have broken other armies. But there were limits even to cultural conditioning. On Guadalcanal, Japanese troops called the island Starvation Island. On New Guinea, entire units dissolved as soldiers too weak to fight simply wandered into the jungle to die. The spiritual commitment to enduring hardship meant nothing when bodies literally consumed themselves, when men became too weak to pull triggers or carry rifles. The American forces fighting in the Pacific faced their own supply challenges. Distances were vast, shipping was limited, tropical conditions complicated food preservation. But the difference was that American logistics treated these as problems to be solved rather than hardships to be endured. The military devoted enormous resources to developing rations that could withstand tropical heat, to establishing supply routes that could deliver food to forward positions, to creating refrigeration systems that could preserve fresh food even in equatorial jungles. The commitment to feeding soldiers properly was absolute, and the industrial capacity to fulfill that commitment was adequate to the task. When Japanese soldiers encountered captured American supplies, the psychological impact was shattering. The food itself was almost incomprehensible in its abundance and variety. Canned fruit, chocolate, meat, coffee, all in quantities that seemed wasteful. But more disturbing was what the supplies revealed about American material capacity. Each package represented an industrial system that could produce these items in millions, could transport them across the Pacific, could deliver them to individual soldiers in jungle clearings thousands of miles from home. The same system that Japanese propaganda had mocked as decadent and inefficient was demonstrating organizational capabilities that exceeded anything Japan could match. One of the most psychologically corrosive aspects of the food disparity was how it undermined the narrative of racial and cultural superiority that justified Japanese militarism. The ideology had insisted that Japanese spiritual strength, discipline, and racial purity made them superior to the soft, materialistic Americans. But when spiritual strength proved inadequate to overcome physical starvation, when discipline, meant nothing without calories. When racial purity offered no protection against malnutrition diseases, the ideology revealed itself as empty rhetoric designed to mask material inadequacy. A Japanese naval officer captured at Leyte described the moment when he understood the war was lost. It wasn't during combat or after a particular defeat. It was in an American prisoner of war camp, eating his first full meal in months. He found himself gaining strength, his mind clearing, his body recovering capabilities he'd forgotten he possessed. And he realized that the Americans could do this, could feed thousands of prisoners, enemy prisoners, better than Japan had fed its own combat troops. The superiority we claimed, he wrote later, was revealed as the opposite. We called them weak for caring about material things, but their material strength was overwhelming. We called ourselves strong for enduring privation, but privation was imposed on us by our own system's failure. The Americans demonstrated that the strong provide for their people. We demonstrated that the weak disguise weakness as virtue. The food disparity influenced combat effectiveness in ways both obvious and subtle. The obvious effects showed in physical capability. Malnourished soldiers moved slower, tired faster, thought less clearly, aimed less accurately. German and Japanese troops in the final year of the war weren't just outgunned and outnumbered. They were physically incapable of the sustained effort that combat demanded. American units could maintain combat operations continuously because soldiers could replace expended energy with adequate food. German and Japanese units had to husband their strength, choosing carefully when to engage because their men lacked the physical reserves for prolonged fighting. The subtle effects appeared in morale, unit cohesion, and fighting spirit. Soldiers who knew their logistics system would keep them supplied with adequate food maintained confidence in their command structure and national capabilities. They could focus on combat tasks rather than worrying about survival. They could trust that wounds would be treated, that illness would be addressed, that their lives were valued by the system sending them into danger. German and Japanese soldiers, watching their logistics systems fail, watching supply promises go unfulfilled, watching comrades die from malnutrition, lost faith not just in their commanders, but in the competence of their entire national system. The food scarcity became evidence of larger failures, proof that the great promises of national greatness were lies. The broader strategic implications extended beyond individual battles. The Allies' ability to sustain long campaigns, to maintain pressure continuously, to replace losses and keep fighting derived partially from logistical systems that kept armies fed. The German military had excelled at short, violent campaigns, blitzkrieg, partially because those tactics minimized logistical requirements. But in extended campaigns, sustained attritional warfare, the kind of grinding combat that characterized the final years of the war, German logistics collapsed. The Russian front, North Africa, Italy, France. Everywhere the Wehrmacht tried to fight sustained campaigns, supply failures undermined combat effectiveness. And at the root of many supply failures was the simple fact that Germany had never developed the industrial and agricultural capacity to feed a multi-front war while maintaining civilian morale at home. American abundance was real, but it wasn't accidental or simply a matter of geography. It was the product of specific choices about how to organize society and economy. Democratic capitalism, for all its inefficiencies and contradictions, had proven remarkably effective at generating surplus, at creating productive capacity that exceeded immediate consumption, at organizing complex supply chains that could distribute resources efficiently. The very features of the system that critics identified as wasteful, overproduction, consumer choice, market competition, created resilience and abundance that centrally planned economies couldn't match. This wasn't predestined. In 1933, when Hitler took power and began remaking German economy and society for war, many observers believed authoritarian systems would prove more efficient at mobilizing resources. The ability to ignore civilian preferences, to direct labor and capital by decree, to subordinate everything to military purposes. These seemed like advantages over democratic systems that had to negotiate with unions, respect property rights, maintain some level of consumer satisfaction. But by 1945, the results were clear. The authoritarian system had produced scarcity, inefficiency, and collapse. The democratic system had produced Abundance on a scale that exceeded any authoritarian plan. The German commander in that Belgian farmhouse eventually ordered the captured American rations distributed to his men. He watched them eat, saw their faces as they tasted real coffee and chocolate for the first time in months. He saw understanding dawn in their eyes, the recognition of what the food meant. And he knew that no matter how many orders he gave, no matter what appeals to duty or national honor he made, these men would never again believe in the superiority they'd been promised. The evidence was in their hands, in their mouths, in their gradually strengthening bodies. The Americans had won not just militarily, but philosophically, demonstrating through ration tins and chocolate bars that their system worked and the National Socialist alternative had failed in the final weeks of the war. As Germany collapsed and Japan faced imminent invasion, the food situation reached levels of catastrophe that exceeded mere military significance. German civilians were starving in the cities. Japanese civilians in bombed-out Tokyo were reduced to eating sawdust bread and seaweed. The regimes that had promised strength through hardship had delivered only hardship. Meanwhile, even in the chaos of final victory, American forces maintained their logistical systems. Their soldiers continued eating their 3,500 calories daily, and plans were already underway for feeding the defeated populations, not from charity but from the same abundance that had powered military victory. The post-war reconstruction emphasized this contrast even more dramatically. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Western Europe, was essentially an extension of the same philosophy that had produced those ration tins, the understanding that abundance builds stability, that well-fed populations are stronger and more productive, that investment in human welfare is pragmatic strategy rather than wasteful sentiment. The occupation authorities in Germany and Japan initially focused not on punishment, but on feeding populations, recognizing that hungry people cannot build stable democracies. The same American industrial and agricultural system that had supplied armies in combat now supplied reconstruction efforts with a generosity that stunned former enemies. This generosity wasn't entirely altruistic. It served strategic purposes, countering Soviet influence, creating stable markets for American goods, building alliance systems. But the fact that pragmatic strategy and human welfare aligned, that the same system could pursue self-interest and provide abundance simultaneously, itself demonstrated something about democratic capitalism that authoritarian systems couldn't match. The fascist powers had required choosing between military strength and civilian welfare, had treated helping people as weakness. The democratic system could pursue strength and welfare together, demonstrating that the dichotomy had been false for those who had believed in fascist ideology, who had internalized its teachings about hardness and will and racial destiny. Coming to terms with this reality was shattering. The comfortable narrative in which suffering demonstrated virtue, in which deprivation proved strength, in which material concerns were decadent weakness, all of it collapsed when confronted with the brute fact of American abundance proving more militarily effective than fascist hardness. The men who had sneered at American materialism found themselves begging for American food. The ideology that had dismissed democracy as weak discovered that weakness was having soldiers starve while fighting enemies who ate 3,500 calories daily. The ration tin became, in post-war memory and historical analysis, a symbol of this larger truth. Museums and military historians treat captured German photographs of American supply dumps with particular interest because they reveal the psychological impact of material disparity. The images show German soldiers, emaciated and ragged, standing amid stacks of American supplies that seemed to stretch to the horizon: rations, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, all in quantities that exceeded what German logistics could deliver even at the height of Nazi power. The expressions on the soldiers' faces tell the story better than words. The shock, the disbelief, the dawning understanding that they'd never had a chance, that the war had been lost before it began because the material balance was so overwhelmingly one-sided. But focusing only on material abundance misses the deeper significance. The food disparity wasn't just about having more resources. It was about different philosophical commitments about what human beings deserved, about how societies should value their members, about whether abundance was waste or wisdom. The American soldier eating his Generous rations wasn't just better fed then. His German counterpart. He was the product of a system that treated feeding people properly as fundamental responsibility rather than generous luxury. The German soldier starving in his foxhole wasn't just poorly supplied. He was the victim of an ideology that had romanticized suffering because it couldn't deliver abundance, that had made virtue of necessity and called deprivation strength. The Cold War continued this ideological battle in modified form. The Soviet Union, like fascist Germany and Japan before it, insisted that communist discipline and central planning would prove superior to democratic chaos and capitalist waste. And like the fascist powers, the Soviet system ultimately failed not primarily for military reasons, but because it couldn't match democratic capitalism's ability to generate abundance and distribute it effectively. The bread lines in Moscow, the empty store shelves, the chronic shortages of basic goods, these were the peacetime equivalent of those starving German soldiers in the Ardennes. Evidence that authoritarian central planning couldn't match democratic market systems at the fundamental task of providing for populations. The historical irony is profound. The fascist and communist ideologies promised strength through discipline, efficiency through planning, victory through superior will. They dismissed democratic concern with human welfare as weakness, materialism as decadence, abundance as waste. But in every confrontation, World War II, the Cold War, continuing struggles between authoritarian and democratic systems, the democracies proved stronger precisely because they took care of their people better, because the abundance wasn't weakness but strength, because the system that feeds its soldiers 3,500 calories daily turns out to fight more effectively than the system that starves its troops and calls it virtue. In the end, those American ration tins represented something more than food. They were arguments in metal and chocolate, evidence that could be held, tasted, understood even by men whose ideological conditioning had taught them to dismiss precisely what the tins demonstrated. They were proof that abundance serves strength, that caring for human welfare isn't weakness, that the system which values its people proves more effective than the system which treats them as expendable. They were, quite literally, the taste of freedom, not freedom as abstract principle, but freedom as the practical capacity to organize society so that even soldiers in combat eat better than most civilians in authoritarian states. The German commander who opened that captured ration tin in January 1945 was experiencing the collapse of his worldview in the most visceral way possible. The food in his hands was more than nutrition. It was truth, unavoidable and indigestible by propaganda. It was the future judging the past and finding it wanting. It was proof that everything he'd been told about weakness and strength, about sacrifice and abundance, about the superiority of will over material resources, had been comprehensively, catastrophically wrong. And somewhere across the line, an American soldier was probably complaining about having canned hash again, maybe throwing away half a chocolate bar because he'd had too much candy that week, completely unaware that his casual abundance was destroying enemy ideology more effectively than any bomb or bullet. That soldier represented a civilization that had solved the problem of feeding people, that treated abundance as normal rather than miraculous, that considered keeping soldiers well supplied a basic obligation rather than remarkable achievement. He was fighting for a system that worked, and the evidence was in every meal he ate. The snow continued falling in the Ardennes, covering the devastation with the same impartial silence it had offered to every winter battle in history. But beneath that snow, in frozen foxholes and commandeered farmhouses, in the contrast between full stomachs and empty ones, between systems that valued human life and systems that spent it carelessly, the true nature of the war was being revealed, not as a contest between warriors, but as a judgment on philosophies, not as a test of courage, but as a demonstration of which system could actually deliver on its promises to sustain the people it sent to fight. History would record the tanks and battles, the strategies and commanders, the great movements of armies across continents. But perhaps the most consequential story was simpler and more intimate. The story of what men ate, of how they were fed or starved, of whether the systems they fought for valued them enough to keep them alive. In that story, told through ration Thierry Trias continuance and mess halls, through chocolate bars and ersatz coffee, through abundance and deprivation, The outcome of the war was written in a language more fundamental than tactics or doctrine. The epilogue to this story played out in the decades after the war, in the memories and testimonies of survivors who carried the experience of hunger or abundance with them for the rest of their lives. German veterans, when they gathered in later years, often spoke less about combat than about hunger, about the taste of American rations after surrender, about the moment they realized their own system had failed them at the most basic level. The humiliation of defeat had many components, but perhaps none cut deeper than the recognition that they'd been starving while fighting enemies who threw food away, that the suffering they'd endured had been preventable, that their own leadership had sent them to fight a war without adequately planning to keep them alive. American veterans told different stories, often unaware of the profound impact their abundance had on enemy morale. They complained about sea rations getting monotonous, about wanting home cooking, about the petty discomforts of military life. They had no idea that their complaints themselves, the luxury of being bored with adequate food rather than desperate for any food, represented a civilization gap that enemies couldn't cross. The American soldier who groused about having spam again was exercising a form of freedom that the starving German soldier couldn't even imagine, the freedom to take abundance for granted, to expect variety, to assume that the system would continue providing not just adequately, but generously in the immediate post-war years. As occupation forces administered defeated territories, the food contrast continued shaping perceptions and outcomes. American military government officials, confronted with starving German and Japanese civilians, implemented feeding programs that often provided better nutrition than populations had received under their own governments even before the war. The daily ration in occupied Germany under American administration exceeded what German civilians had received in 1944. This wasn't just humanitarian, it was pragmatic recognition that stable democratic societies couldn't be built among starving populations. But the pragmatism itself reflected democratic values. The understanding that human welfare and political stability were connected, that abundance served purposes beyond mere survival. The psychological impact on former enemies was complex and profound. There was gratitude, certainly, but also something more troubling: the recognition that they'd been comprehensively wrong about everything. The ideology that had sent them to war insisted that Americans were soft, decadent, incapable of sacrifice, that democratic concern with material welfare indicated weakness. Yet here were those supposedly soft Americans feeding their former enemies, demonstrating organizational competence and material abundance that exceeded anything the fascist systems had achieved even at the height of their power. The cognitive dissonance was severe. How could the weak prove so strong? How could the decadent prove so capable? How could materialism produce more effective results than spiritual commitment? The answer, which took years for many to accept, was that the entire framework had been inverted. Materialism wasn't opposition to human values but expression of them. The insistence that human beings deserved adequate food, shelter, comfort was the foundation of strength, not its negation. Abundance wasn't weakness but the fruit of systems that worked. Democracy's concern with human welfare wasn't decadence, but recognition of basic truth. People who are well-treated produce more, create more, fight more effectively, build more stable societies than people who are treated as expendable. This lesson resonated beyond the immediate post-war period into the reconstruction of both Germany and Japan as democratic societies. The American occupation authorities insisted on certain political reforms, but they also insisted on adequate nutrition, on rebuilding economies that could provide for populations, on creating systems that generated abundance rather than managed scarcity. The message was clear: democracy wasn't just a political system, but an economic and social philosophy that took human welfare seriously. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe not just with aid, but with a philosophy that abundance stabilized societies and deprivation destabilized them. West Germany's post-war economic miracle, Japan's rapid recovery and growth, the transformation of both nations into prosperous democracies. These outcomes weren't predetermined. They resulted from specific choices about economic organization, about valuing human welfare, about building systems that generated abundance. And those choices were influenced heavily by the wartime experience, by the lesson that systems which kept Their people, well-fed and comfortable, proved stronger than systems that romanticized suffering. The food story also illuminated uncomfortable truths about the societies that perpetrated the war's greatest atrocities. The Holocaust, the Japanese massacres in China, the systematic murder of millions. These horrors occurred in the same nations, administered by the same governments, that couldn't adequately feed their own soldiers. There was connection between the callousness toward human life evident in genocidal policies and the callousness that sent soldiers to fight without adequate supply. Both reflected systems that treated human beings as expendable, that subordinated individual welfare to mystical national purposes, that measured success by willingness to sacrifice rather than ability to provide. The contrast with American racial policies was instructive in this context. The United States in the 1940s was deeply racist, maintained legal segregation, denied basic rights to African Americans and other minorities. These were profound moral failures that would require decades of struggle to begin addressing. But even within a racist society, the military's commitment to adequate nutrition extended to all soldiers regardless of race. Black soldiers in segregated units ate the same rations, received the same caloric intake, had access to the same supply systems as white soldiers. The racism was real and damaging, but it existed alongside institutional commitments to human welfare that even flawed democracies maintained and that totalitarian systems didn't. This wasn't to excuse American racism or to claim moral superiority. The historical record on race makes any such claim impossible, but it illustrated an important distinction: democratic systems, even when failing to live up to their principles, maintained institutional structures that valued human life in ways totalitarian systems didn't. The commitment to feeding soldiers adequately wasn't dependent on considering them superior beings or members of a master race. It was institutional obligation baked into military doctrine and organizational culture that treated all soldiers as valuable regardless of how society outside the military ranked them. The long-term influence of the wartime food experience appeared in unexpected places. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, one reason American forces struggled initially was that commanders had assumed the lesson about logistics wouldn't need relearning. But supply lines in Korea proved challenging, and there were periods when frontline troops didn't receive adequate rations. The complaints were immediate and vocal. American soldiers in 1950 had internalized the expectation of abundant, high-quality food as their right. They'd been raised in the system that produced those ration tins, and they expected the same level of support. The military responded by fixing supply problems, adapting logistics to Korean terrain and conditions, ensuring that by later in the war, food supply was adequate. The expectation of abundance had become non-negotiable. Meanwhile, North Korean and Chinese forces fighting in the same war struggled with supply problems that would have been familiar to Wehrmacht or Japanese troops a few years earlier. The communist systems proved better than fascist ones at generating ideological commitment, at sustaining soldiers through hardship with promises of future utopia. But they proved no better at actual logistics, at getting adequate food to frontline troops, at maintaining the complex supply chains that modern warfare demanded. The pattern repeated. Authoritarian systems could inspire sacrifice but struggled to deliver abundance. Democratic systems assumed abundance as baseline expectation and organized to deliver it. The generational memory of wartime hunger shaped post-war European and Japanese culture in ways that persisted for decades. Germans who had been young adults during the war never entirely lost the habits formed by scarcity, the reluctance to waste food, the hoarding of supplies, the inability to take abundance for granted. Their children, growing up in the prosperous 1960s and 70s, often couldn't understand their parents' attitudes, the way they saved everything, wasted nothing, always prepared for scarcity. But the parents carried cellular memory of hunger, of watching friends and comrades die from malnutrition, of understanding that systems could fail catastrophically at the basic task of providing food. Japanese culture retained similar traces. The generation that survived the war carried memories of near starvation, of American firebombing campaigns that destroyed food supplies, of the immediate post-war years when survival itself was uncertain. They built post-war Japan with ferocious determination to ensure abundance, to never again depend on military adventure for resources, to create an economy that could feed its population without conquest. The memory of hunger became generative rather than merely traumatic, driving reconstruction and economic growth. American culture, by contrast, emerged from the war with abundance expectations intact and reinforced. The GI Bill sent veterans to college, helped them buy houses, supported family formation, all policies that assumed abundance was available and should be distributed broadly. The post-war economic boom validated these assumptions. America in the 1950s became the society of conspicuous consumption, of television advertisements celebrating material plenty, of supermarkets stocked with variety that would have stunned anyone from any previous era. The culture that had produced those ration tins extended the same philosophy to civilian life. Abundance was normal, expected, and achievable through proper economic organization. This American abundance became weapon in the Cold War, demonstrable proof of capitalism's superiority over communism. The famous kitchen debate between Nixon and Khrushchev in 1959, arguing over the relative merits of American and Soviet appliances, echoed the earlier argument made by ration tins. When Khrushchev insisted that the Soviet Union would bury America through superior production, he was making the same claim German and Japanese leaders had made, that authoritarian discipline would outperform democratic chaos. And like his fascist predecessors, he was wrong for the same reasons. Centrally planned systems couldn't match market economies at generating and distributing abundance. The Berlin airlift of 1948 to 49 provided perhaps the most dramatic post-war demonstration of democratic abundance. When the Soviets blockaded West Berlin, attempting to starve the city into submission, the American and British response was to supply the entire city by air, not just with bare survival rations, but with adequate food, fuel, medicine, everything needed to maintain normal life. At the peak, planes landed every few minutes, bringing supplies that exceeded what the city needed just to survive. The airlift wasn't just logistical achievement, it was political theater, demonstration that democratic systems could provide abundance even under impossible constraints, that the commitment to human welfare wasn't abandoned when conditions became difficult. The symbolic weight of this was enormous. Berliners who had fought against the Americans just 3 years earlier now depended on American supplies for survival. The contrast with Soviet behavior, blockading a city to starve it, couldn't have been clearer. And the deeper contrast between systems that generated abundance and systems that managed scarcity through control was equally clear. The airlift failed as military tactic. The Soviets could have shut it down with force, but succeeded as demonstration of values and capabilities. Democracy proved it could feed people even when doing so seemed impossible. Communism proved it would starve people to achieve political objectives. The pattern extended globally throughout the Cold War. Countries that aligned with democratic capitalism generally saw living standards rise, food security improve, abundance become normal. Countries under communist control generally experienced chronic shortages, rationing, food insecurity. There were exceptions and complications. The developing world faced challenges that exceeded ideological explanations, but the broad pattern held. By the 1980s, the material superiority of the capitalist world was so obvious that communist ideology shifted from claiming superior production to attacking consumerism as spiritual emptiness. The argument became, yes, capitalism produces more stuff, but we have superior values. It was the same argument Nazi Germany had made when confronted with American abundance, that material success indicated spiritual poverty. The response to both fascism and communism was the same. Material success isn't opposed to spiritual or social welfare, but enables it. Societies where people are adequately fed produce better art, science, philosophy than societies where people are hungry. Abundance creates the security and freedom necessary for human flourishing. The choice between material welfare and higher purposes is false. Material security provides foundation for everything else. The B.Y. 1989. When the Berlin Wall fell, the lesson taught by those ration tins had been validated comprehensively. The Soviet Union, despite decades of effort, despite military parity, despite competing successfully in space and technology, collapsed partially because it couldn't feed its own people adequately. The same organizational and philosophical failures that prevented Germany from keeping its Wehrmacht supplied prevented the Soviet Union from stocking grocery stores. The same contempt for material concerns that made fascism celebrate suffering made communism tolerate chronic shortages. And populations living under those systems, when given the choice, voted with their feet for the system that delivered abundance. The historical assessment of World War II often focuses on military operations, strategic decisions, leadership quality. These matter, certainly. But the war was also, perhaps fundamentally, a test of competing social and economic systems. Could fascist organization outperform democratic chaos? Could authoritarian discipline outproduce capitalist markets? Could ideological commitment overcome material disadvantage? The answer delivered by those ration tins, by American logistics, by the contrast between well-fed and starving soldiers, was definitive: no. Democratic capitalism, for all its flaws and contradictions, proved more effective at the basic tasks of organizing human society than any authoritarian alternative. This didn't make democracy morally superior in every dimension. American racism, European colonialism, capitalist exploitation all represented profound moral failures. But it meant that claims of authoritarian efficiency were revealed as myth, that the supposed advantages of central planning and dictatorial control didn't translate into superior outcomes, that systems respecting human welfare and generating abundance proved stronger than systems glorifying sacrifice and managing scarcity. The German commander, who opened that captured ration tin in January 1945, was encountering this truth in its most concentrated form. The food in his hands wasn't just nutrition but evidence, not just calories but argument, not just supplies but philosophy. It demonstrated that everything his nation had believed about strength and weakness, everything it had taught about the superiority of will over resources, everything it had promised about victory through hardness and discipline, had been comprehensively wrong. The Americans hadn't defeated Germany primarily through better tactics or braver soldiers. They defeated Germany by being better organized, more productive, more effective at taking care of their people. They'd won the argument about which system actually worked in the decades since. That lesson has sometimes been forgotten and needed relearning. Each generation faces authoritarian movements claiming that discipline and control can outperform democratic messiness, that sacrifice should be celebrated over abundance, that material concerns indicate spiritual poverty. And each generation has the opportunity to remember what those ration tins taught, that systems taking human welfare seriously prove stronger than systems treating people as expendable, that abundance reflects organizational competence rather than weakness, that democracy's commitment to providing for its citizens is source of strength rather than vulnerable decadence. The snow in the Ardennes melted eventually, spring came, the war ended. The farmhouse where that commander confronted the reality of his defeat returned to civilian use, probably hosts tourists now, perhaps has a small plaque marking its minor role in history. The ration tin itself, if it survived, might sit in a museum somewhere. One artifact among thousands illustrating the war's material dimensions, but the truth it represented persists beyond any physical object. That freedom isn't just political abstraction, but practical capacity to provide for people. That democracy proves its worth not only in voting booths, but in supply chains and logistics systems. That the system which feeds its soldiers 3,500 calories daily while enemies starve isn't weak. It's the future, demonstrating with every meal what human societies can achieve when they organize around human welfare rather than ideological fantasy. The greatest victory wasn't military, but philosophical, proving that abundance serves strength, that caring for human life indicates power rather than softness, that the system which values its people and delivers on that valuation through actual material support will defeat the system that glorifies suffering and delivers only hardship. That lesson, written in chocolate bars and coffee tins, in the contrast between full stomachs and empty ones, remains as relevant today as it was in that frozen Belgian farmhouse 80 years ago. The choice between systems that provide and systems that merely promise remains perpetually before us. The evidence of which works better sits there still, preserved in history, waiting to teach each generation the same fundamental truth about human society, material welfare, and the real meaning of strength.